This episode of Tim's Enthusiast Garage is brought to you by Auto Couture Motoring. Auto Couture Motoring is a world-class automotive center focused on performance products and specialized vehicle maintenance. With a combined 40 years of expertise modifying and maintaining BMW, Porsche, Ferrari, Mercedes-Benz, and most performance-centered brands. They're conveniently located in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, with state-of-the-art capabilities in a 13,000 square foot facility. One of the best shops anywhere in the United States, Auto Couture Motoring.
Come on, go!
My name's Tim. I'm a musician, a car collector, an automotive journalist, and a lover of all things automotive. I've bought and sold collectible cars for 2 decades, and I hope my experiences and my point of view helps you find the car of your dreams.
The E46 M3. It's hard to think of now, but at one time, this car was brand new. And there was a moment in time where we saw this car for the first time. And for me, that was an article in Evo magazine. And this car has a prominent bonnet bulge that really lends it to evocative photography. The photography layout in Evo magazine really cemented it for me. And like I said, now we're just in the era where the new M3 and M4 were introduced with those ghastly, huge nostrils. And at the same time, when this car was introduced, the E36 was a very classic, almost like a classically updated version of the E30. When the E36 M3 was introduced, I loved that car. I thought it was perfectly proportioned. However, in the United States, the E36 was a little bit muted in performance compared with its European counterpart. With the E46, they righted a lot of the wrongs that they transgressed with the E36. One of the things I want to cover in this video is where the E46 M3, and in particular, this Imola red E46 M3, sits for me not only in the used car performance category, but also as an M car. Where does it fit in the BMW legacy? And then more specifically, where does it fit as an M3? You guys that are E36 fans, listen, I love an E36. I think it actually gets kind of a bad rap. The US engine is not a horrible thing, but in the Gestalt, I just think that it's basically a coupe or sedan version of the E36 that doesn't go far enough to really differentiate itself as an M car. One of the things that makes the E46 really appealing to the enthusiast is its engine. The S54 engine has independent throttle bodies and is unique not to the US market, but the whole world. This engine serviced this car worldwide. And the car really took things forward quite a bit. In fact, when it was new, the performance of the car was so far ahead of where the E36 was, particularly in US trim, that this car really set a new benchmark. The differential in this car, the tuning of the suspension in this car, the way the car feels going over bumps, the way it handles undulations, all those sorts of things. The E46 actually feels somewhat similar to the E30 in its sort of very alive steering rack feel. And the E36 really never had that. The E36 now is kind of coming into its own as a veritable classic. In terms of driver experience and again, I'm a Lotus fan, so if you're a Lotus fan, you truly appreciate good steering. The E30 and the E46, in my opinion, have the best steering. And for me, steering is a lot of what makes a car great. A lot of people don't love the Ferrari 348, but I almost like it better than the 355 because it has great steering feel. That's one of the things that made the E30 great. That's what makes this E46 great. All the M cars, M3s that came after this, while they got significantly faster, and I mean significantly faster, M cars in recent years have gone so much further in terms of performance that it's hard to really directly compare the cars. For me, obviously, the E30 is certainly, as you know, I love the Cosworth, the E30. That whole DTM era, the touring car era, really solidified those cars in a lot of people's imagination as sort of the pinnacle of M3. The original E30 M3 was a true motorsport variant, and in fact was much more of a homologation special than an actual product line. And as we've moved forward, cars like the M4 and the M3 now are very much products. I'm not saying that to diminish them at all, but what I am saying is that original car was a true motorsport variant. And so for me, the E30 takes some real beating. That being said, the E46 for me, and I'll cut right to the chase, is my personal favorite M3. While the E90 did move performance on a little, the V8 doesn't quite have the BMW heritage of this inline six. Now, even though the original M3 had a 4-cylinder, original M5 and later M cars with those inline sixes, to me, have always been the sweetest. And this car is no exception. The independent throttle bodies on this car ensure that when you step on the throttle, it's instant power. And the power builds really nicely, really smoothly, like that traditional inline six BMW. I mean, that's the engine that they became known for, that they became renowned for. And the way this car reacts in corners based against the later V8 car, the E90 was just a little bit less of an M car, again, to me personally. So if we're saying what's the best M3, the E46, I think, is the greatest true M3. You still have the Hofmeister kink in the back, sort of reminiscent and echoes that the E9 or the 3-liter CSL. You have design features, even including this. I'm a sucker for the heritage. They really got the heritage right. I also think that this car versus the E36, this one is a complete sort of redesign in terms of the hood is different, the wings are different, the fenders are flared. It's a different bodied car than a regular E46 coupe. So while a lot of people say, well, why don't you, what do you think of the ZHP 330 E46? And for me, I mean, it's just not an M car. With this car, they really kind of took it much closer to where that original E30 was in terms of box fender flares. It's more of a track-focused car. With the CSL version of this car, where you get the carbon roof, the carbon airbox, it's much more stripped down. Certainly that's the absolute pinnacle of E46. It was never available in a manual transmission, and I do think, in terms of pros and cons, and in terms of what makes this the best M3, I am not a huge fan of the SMG. As you can see in the background, there's a Maserati 4200. I'm a fan of the Grand Sport. I love the Grand Sport. This is a 4200 Cambia Corsa, which ironically uses a very similar setup. The difference is it ruins this experience, whereas it heightens the Maserati experience. Now, that gets into like transmission tuning and a lot of other variables that I think, even like with the modern 8-speed transmissions, multiple companies use that ZF 8-speed, and some tune it really well, some don't. Original E30 uses the same, similar transmission setup to the Cosworth, and the E30 has very much better shift feel than the Cosworth. So, not all transmissions are created equal. Certainly this car with a 6-speed, I think it makes the experience. Moving on to where this car fits in the M car category, regardless of whether it's an M3, M4, 1M, all that. I think that this car is right up at the top of the heap. The car does have some negatives, and we'll kind of go over that. The negatives are, anytime a car gets this old, and this shares a lot of its negatives with other cars from the early 2000s, and not unlike other M cars from the early 2000s.
BMWs from this era are notorious for seals that crack and fall apart prematurely, and for sprayed-on coatings on everything that are just unnecessary. I've started to replace some of the worn items, including this shift knob.
One car that I think has to be on the greatest M car of all time list is the E39 M5. The E39 M5 is exactly the right use of a V8, and it's one people are like, well, if you love that car, why don't you love the E90 M3? I like the E90 M3. I just don't think it's a better M3 than the E46. That E39 M5 has to be at the top of the list. The E30 also is at the top of the list, but when value comes into it, this car really trumps it in terms of value. And I think sonically, particularly with the carbon airbox, which no, this one does not have, but it does have an exhaust and it does have a filter, and it sounds great. And it revs out beautifully. It makes music. It's a little more raspy. I mean, one of the comments on the S54 engine is that it's a raspy engine. It is. But it's very motorsport. It has a very motorsport sound, and it's got a silkiness to it. E30 M3, E46 M3, and E39 M5 are probably my favorite M cars of all time, and I'm going to delete from that the M1, because the M1 is sort of its own thing. I wouldn't even call it an M car in the traditional sense. It's an exotic, it's more hand-built, it's just it's its own thing. Before we get to like strict pros and cons, or go through some of the things you need to look at when you're buying an E46 M3, or go out on the road and actually drive this car, I get the question a lot, well, what if you had X to spend, would you buy this, 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 or this? And when it comes to this car, that's a real quandary. I have to be honest, this car was baselined by BMW directly against the 996. This car, price point wise, right now, where these cars are at, this is a manual transmission, one owner car, so it's going to be, you know, if this car was on Bring a Trailer, it's going to be sort of towards the top of the heap, and the top of the heap for these cars is really coincides with some great 996-2s, which you know I love. If I'm honest, this car loses to that car for a couple reasons. One is this car is based on a 3 Series, which, not that there's anything wrong with the 3 Series, but it's not a car designed specifically to go around racetracks, which is what the 911 is. The 996 in particular, and I've sung its praises, you know, sort of ad nauseum, so I won't go into it here directly, but the 996 and even 997, which this competes against, it has an edge in a couple ways. So we took, my friend John, who was the original owner of this car, and I took our sons to Tail of the Dragon. I took my 996-2, he took this. And they were pretty closely matched in terms of acceleration out of corners, but where I could dive into corners, and we drove, you know, each other's cars, the 911 is just clearly a tool for doing nothing but going around racetracks, and it really shows. This car, one of the weaknesses is, you know, from the factory, it didn't have great brakes. This car at a track day or at the Tail of the Dragon will wilt brakes quickly. That's a dynamic downside. One of the cons that you need to look for when you're looking at these cars, things that wear out quicker, and one of the things that this car is somewhat notorious for that you need to look at when you're looking at one of these, or even an M Coupe, is where the rear subframe mounts to the car. It's under such stress that it can actually crack the mounting points on the chassis. It's definitely not something that's unfixable, but it's unthinkable on a 911. Additionally, you know, this car versus the 911, another con of this car, these cars wear rod bearings. It's known. There's actually a recall. This car had them replaced by BMW under recall. So in terms of IMS, which is, you know, greatly exaggerated on the 911s, or bearings on this car, I wouldn't say that either is a deal killer on these cars, and certainly isn't something that is definitely going to affect your car per se, but it's something to be aware of, and both are somewhat costly repairs. And in the case of the 911, I think that is even a little more adept at being beat on for an entire day at a racetrack. The brakes, the engine, the gearbox in the 911 are just that one shade more pure than this car. As with any of my videos, I do aim to sort of give you some information, an opinion from an ownership perspective. I've owned E46 M3s. In fact, this is my second E46 M3, and I've owned most of the cars that this competes with. And so I know when you're shopping, and I know this because when I'm shopping, I'm looking for information and to some extent opinion of other enthusiasts that can sort of baseline these cars against each other and say, you know, is this the best M car? Which brings me to how this E46 came to be in my possession. I actually bought this car from the estate of my friend John. Major John, as he was known. Career military, great father, and super enthusiast. In fact, the month before he died, and I still regret not being able to attend this, in the absolute throes of almost being unable to deal with the pain of stage 4 lung cancer, and riddled with cancer that had spread into his brain and all through his body, he attended the Porsche experience in Atlanta. And he somehow managed to drift a Taycan around the drift circuit and took a 911 turbo out and actually was so sick at the end of it that he had to be hospitalized that we thought he was going to not make it home from Atlanta. He did make it home from Atlanta. He lived another week, and it's a heartbreaker. He was only, I think, 51, 52 years old, and he was gone too soon. This car was very much a part of Ethan, who you've met in another video, my oldest son and I's life. And the thought of it sort of being sold on, he had a couple cars and bikes, and fantastically, friends and family were able to buy all of them. So all of the cars did stay in the hands of friends. I am in the process of, there's some styling things on this car that maybe wouldn't quite be my particular choice, but were John's, and I really wanted them to stay on the car for this video. And it just goes to, it speaks to, you know, the legacy that we leave behind as enthusiasts. And I would just encourage you, when you go on a trip to the Nürburgring or to the Tail of the Dragon or to attend an F1 race or a NASCAR race with a friend, and you're on that road trip, it could be the last road trip with that friend. For John and I, you know, I remember the last time we, it actually made it into my Instagram story. The last time we rolled together, I was in the Bentley, he was in this, my friend Michael was in his GTR, and my other friend Kevin was in his E63S. And the E63S is significantly faster than the R35 GTR. That's a fact. But, you know, that was the last time we drove anywhere together. And it means a lot to me to have this car. I will pass it down, hopefully, to my son, who has those memories, you know, will have those memories for years, decades. And so I did want to leave it sort of as he left it, for at least until I shot this video, you know, just as sort of a testament to the care that he did invest into the car in keeping this Imola red, you know, sort of high optioned manual transmission M3 in as good a condition as it is. And he did daily drive this car. It has 100,000 miles. So it isn't a low mile beauty queen by any stretch of the imagination, but it is well cared for, and it's a heck of a drive. One potential issue with this car is the other cars that are in its price range. Nice E46 M3s with manual transmissions are selling for the same kind of money as, say, RS5, or for much less, a Maserati Grand Sport. Heck, you could even get a Maserati Gran Turismo, but Gran Turismos with the automatic transmissions, you really got to spend quite a bit more to get one that has the automated manual. I don't know, an MC. You've got to spend too much money. So that car really isn't. And I don't think it's as enjoyable as this car or the Grand Sport. These cars have gotten pricey all of a sudden, so that's one thing to think about. Is this the best M3? Certainly there's going to be disagreement. There's no way you could make a definitive statement, and it's an arbitrary statement. I mean, there's really no right answer. For me, the E46 is the right amount of acceleration, the right amount of bold looks, and the right amount of cornering ability, ride the slide ability, and depreciation. The time to buy these cars and really be right in the price was a few years ago. These are really starting to kind of creep back up in value. Good ones are 30, 40, 50. I've seen 60. Heck, the CSL cars are going for crazy money. But it's a lot of car, and I think it's a lot of analog, really nice driving car. There's not a lot of comps out there. You know, there's a lot of cars that, you know,
realistically speaking, there's just not a lot of cars that tick all the same boxes that this car ticks as seamlessly. And that's really the bottom line. Most of the cars I review on Tim's Enthusiast Garage are cars that I own, cars that I kind of lusted after when I was a kid. And this one, again, is no exception. I always thought, man, it'd be great to have an E46 M3. But if you're looking for a true M car experience, a true M3 experience, I think the E46 might be the right call. The E46 offers a ton of performance, and it's kind of a timeless classic already. So from that perspective, I think if you really like the E46 M3, or if you want an M car, now might be the time to buy an E46 M3. I hope this video was helpful, and if it was, check out some of my other videos, share one with a friend, by all means. Please subscribe. Thanks for watching.